Thank you for attending this event, commemorating the 500th anniversary of Leonardo da Vinci, promoting Italian excellence in the world through his genius. This lecture is part of the series Leonardo500, dedicated to Leonardo da Vinci, that will continue throughout the year. We are looking forward to the upcoming conference Leonardo da Vinci, Inventing the Future, will be held at UCLA on October the 18th and 19th, in collaboration with the Institute. The conference will focus on Leonardo's contribution to flight, the heart, robotics, and artificial intelligence. The conference will also feature a screening of the Rai Cinema documentary, Being Leonardo da Vinci, directed and starring Massimiliano Finazzer-Flori, who will be in attendance at UCLA. The film offers viewers a captivating look into what shapes and makes the mind of a legend. The film will also be screened in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Las Vegas, Nevada, and earlier in the next month in Santa Ana at the Bowers Museum. I would like to recognize and thank tonight Vito Campese, who is in attendance this evening. He is the president of the Italian Scientists and Scholars of North America. It represents the ever-continuing scientific and technological excellent relationship between Italy and the U.S. I'm truly delighted to present this evening Professor Kevin Petti, who will explore how Leonardo employed dissection techniques generations ahead of university anatomists and discovered human structure and function unknown to physicians for centuries. He will also give a lecture at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston on September the 17th. It is a great pleasure to have him here this evening at the Institute. Thank you very much, Kevin. Tonight's event is organized by the Italian Cultural Institute in collaboration with San Diego Miramar College. This is the third event of the series Leonardo500, organized with UCLA, the Getty Museum, Chapman University, Baylor College of Medicine, and the Consulate General of Italy in Houston. We hope to see you at the Institute for some of our upcoming events, which include the opening celebration with the artists from the exhibit currently on view at the Institute, Italo-Americana, Italian Illustration Takes on America, on September 20th, as well as other Da Vinci events, including the screening, it will be the U.S. premiere of I, Leonardo, produced by Ska Arte, that will be screened here at the Institute on October the 21st. Now, as a courtesy to others, please, I ask you to kindly silence or turn off your phones. At the conclusion of the lecture, Professor Petti will have a brief Q&A with the audience. Now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Kevin Petti. Thank you, Kevin.
Let's go back. I want to thank the Italian Cultural Institute in Los Angeles for the invitation and the director, and it's always such a pleasure to come up here and see my friends to celebrate these ideas. I'm just so honored that I have this opportunity, and I want to thank you for your attention. So tonight we're here to talk about Leonardo500. 500 years since the death of Leonardo, we will observe that. But before we discuss Leonardo, I'd like to reference other Renaissance masters, to make the point that anatomy influenced their works as well. To think that it was only Leonardo as an anatomist in the Renaissance would be completely unfair. Many of the Renaissance masters studied anatomy to help them with their art. But the point we'll make, the point of departure and distinction, is that Leonardo did it for so much more than just to help him with his art. It was also for his amazing intellectual curiosity. So I'd like to speak also about Michelangelo, Raphael, and Botticelli. We all know Michelangelo and his great works such as David, 1501 to 1504, often described as the perfect representation of man. For those of you who don't know, I visit Italy. I'm there about 2 months a year teaching study abroad. My principal job is to teach human anatomy and human dissection to undergraduate students preparing for medical school. But I also take them abroad to introduce the humanities into the sciences. And we look at these great works of art for certainly pieces of art, but also for their anatomical accuracy. And I proffer the question, did Michelangelo have to dissect to be so anatomically accurate? And the answer is clearly yes. And we know that this isn't supposition, that it's in the scholarship. If we look at the writings of Giorgio Vasari, the first real art historian. He writes, for the Church of Santo Spirito in Florence, Michelangelo made a crucifix of wood, which was placed above the lunette of the high altar, where it still is. He made this to please the prior, like the pastor, who placed rooms at his disposal where Michelangelo very often used to flay dead bodies in order to discover the secrets of anatomy. So I know you're all familiar with the geography of Florence. If you look at the Arno River, south of that is the Basilica of Santo Spirito, which once upon a time had a hospital as well. And that's where Michelangelo, as a boy, 17, 18 years of age, accessed cadavers for dissection. And there's scholarship that writes about how he had a candle. He would do it surreptitiously in the middle of the night, and this candle would burn down as a kind of hourglass, so he would know the evening was over, and he'd wrap up the body and then wind up exiting. So he carved a wooden crucifix that is still there, according to the writings of Vasari and others. This is the one done in 1492, for the Americans, an easy date to remember. But we know that it's been there for these many years, since 1492, to thank a priest for the access to cadavers for anatomy. Tonight's talk is about connecting art and anatomy, and this is a quintessential example of that. A wonderful piece of art in thanks for anatomical investigation. And it's very important from an art history standpoint as well. It's a wooden sculpture by Michelangelo. It is thought to be the first nude Christ that was ever done, and it's still there for us to view. So we know that he studied anatomy. We know that he dissected. I mean, he would be out all night doing this, lying to his father, coming in at dawn, and his father wanted to know where he was, and he had sprinkled wine all over himself, so his father would think that he was out carousing, and he would take a beating for that instead of tell his father he was doing dissection. Later on in his life, when he did things we're all familiar with, like the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the scholarship points in the direction that he was informed by the shapes of human organs. And as I keep referencing the scholarship says this or that, tonight what I'm doing is really weaving together the works of many others to tell this very interesting story. So when we look at the creation of Adam, God reaching out and creating Adam, 1991, Frank Meshberger, who was a physician, published a journal article in the Journal of the American Medical Association where he said this crazy shape that we see right here that God is reaching out of is really a mid-sagittally sectioned brain. So what I did was I went into my anatomy lab and I took a photograph of one of the brains that I've extracted from my cadavers and pasted on top like this. And now let me remove it. Well, what do you think? You know, for those of you who know your anatomy, if you look at it over here, it's really freakishly accurate. If you look right here, this bent knee is the optic chiasm. That's where the two optic nerves cross up. This little dangling angel's foot right here is the infundibulum with the pituitary at the end. And for those of you who know your anatomy, the pituitary has two lobes, and that's exactly how he represents it there. This is the vertebral to the basilar arteries, coming up to this angel, which is the brainstem, where you see the cord come up to the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. The differentiation between the occipital and parietal lobes is also demarcated quite well. So the neuroanatomical references are really quite profound and hard to ignore. Or is it not there and we're just making it up in our minds? I think a master like Michelangelo wouldn't do something like this if that's not what he intended for it to be done. And it's funny because I show my students this and they look at it, and I kind of heard many of you groan who are unfamiliar with this because you saw it for the first time. And my students almost get angry with me. I remember one student, a woman, stomped her foot and said, "Oh, now I can't unsee it. Every time I look now, all I see is a brain, because it's so much there." And if we could make more neuroanatomical references, Michelangelo didn't know this, but let me give it some poetic license. You see God reaching across, and he doesn't have to touch Adam, does he? Just like a neuron that synapses with another, there's a synaptic cleft across it through which the neurotransmitter of life would diffuse. Now, I don't want to adjudicate every last curve that's here, right? But with some poetic license, I think it's a very profound argument. But it's not just here. There was another journal article published in the journal Neurosurgery that made other neuroanatomical references in the panel, The Separation of Light from Darkness. And if we blow up the neck of God, this is a very unusual view. It's also freakishly neuroanatomical. And you see how the authors of the journal article, and I can give you all these references later if you'd like to read the original work, really are accurate anatomically. Let me maybe look at it this way, where you can see a study of necks done in the Renaissance, where you see here's God's very unusual view. Michelangelo never painted another view like this of a neck. And then what the authors did, this is Adam before the fall, this is Adam after the fall, this is from the drunkenness of Noah, this is Eve before the fall, and just for good measure, let's put the rest of the Renaissance triumvirate up there. This is a Leonardo, and this is a Raphael. So when you look at all these necks, do you see how they all have very common characteristics? None of them look like that on the right. So one would argue that that's exactly what Michelangelo intended, for it to be neuroanatomical. But wait, there's more. Another journal article was published in 2000 in the journal Kidney International that looked at the separation of land from water. And you look at this again, a crazy shape that God is arising from. We could see that it's thought to be the shape of a kidney. And Michelangelo understood the separation of waters, right? That's what this particular panel is speaking to in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And if you don't know, Michelangelo suffered terribly from kidney stones. So he knew a lot about kidneys and the separation of waters. So let's leave Michelangelo and talk about Botticelli, right? This is his self-portrait in The Adoration of the Magi in 1475. And then David Lazzari, who's an Italian, a Roman, published a journal article. He's a physician and a surgeon. Published a journal article looking at his work. And here we see the birth of Venus, and you know it's air, it's breath, it's pneuma that's discussed quite, is what's being allegorically expressed here. I want you to look at where I've drawn the little box over here, and in the scholarship it's being discussed that this is the shape of a lung, the mantle that this little goddess is holding up over here, representing air and breath. Maybe it's not quite sufficient for you to point out, but I want you to look here at Primavera, spring, where we see a box in the center there. Can you see two lungs, one on either side? And then Venus in the middle, the heart, love, right? So for love, Venus, the heart. For the brain, God. Could you think of a better organ to represent with God? So this is the discussion that's in the professional literature that tries to connect the arts and the humanities. And I just love this talk, especially when I share it with my students. And if I can tie it all together, this theme of connecting art and anatomy, it's a very famous anatomist out of Padua, the name of Realdo Colombo. And in 1559, he published his one and only anatomical tome, which is very important. Realdo Colombo discovered what's called the lesser circulation, which is the pulmonary circuit, the flow of blood between the right heart and the left heart. And this is the only image that's real art. The whole book is text, is the cover page. And we see at the top here Realdo Colombo, who's doing the dissection, but it's generally agreed upon in the scholarship that this is Michelangelo over here. Because Realdo Colombo was Michelangelo's dear friend and physician, used to treat him for kidney stones. And there's documentation that the two of them were collaborating to illustrate this anatomical text. And you can even see this little cherub, this little Putti down over here, is taking his hand and is holding paintbrushes in his hand, as if he's asking Michelangelo to please come and to illustrate this work. Unfortunately, Realdo Colombo died. The book itself was published posthumously after that, and Michelangelo was quite old and busy reconstructing St. Peter's, so he wasn't able to complete that. And if you're familiar with Federico Zuccari, who is the artist who painted the frescoes in Florence, in the Duomo there, he painted this piece, which is aptly called The Anatomy Lesson. And if you look at it, you can see this is Michelangelo and this is Raphael. And the scholars go and identify many of the other famous Renaissance artists that are doing their paintings, that are doing the dissection that you see right here, making the point that clearly the anatomists of that era dissected. So did Leonardo. So now let's really turn our attention to him. But I will argue that Leonardo did everything in so much deeper a way, so much richer a way, and certainly made quite a bit of advance. He studied many sciences, as you know, optics, geology, botany, hydrodynamics, engineering, but the field that really engaged him the most fully and that he made the most dramatic discoveries are in that of human anatomy. I will argue centuries ahead of the physicians that were teaching anatomy. And I can do that just by putting a few images up over here, and we'll get into some more detail as time goes on. But Leonardo dissected in the neighborhood of 30 cadavers in two eras, one around 1490, and another around 1510, just to give you some general numbers, right? A few years before and a few years after that. Most of that was in Florence, but in other portions of northern Italy. He intended to publish an anatomical text. We know that he did, because surviving to us today is the table of contents for this anatomical text that he never got to publishing. As you know, Leonardo didn't finish many of his works. Well, you look at pieces like this, this is what they were intended for. These, we believe, were studies. This was from his later era. His earlier era was beautiful, but often flawed and anatomically inaccurate. As he did more and more dissections, he corrected it. And it's all told here in his personal papers. And that's what you're looking at here. And I want to make this point. These are not commissioned works of art. When you think of Leonardo and you think of Mona Lisa, that's a commissioned work of art. He had a patron and he produced something. These are his private papers for his own research and his own ruminations. And when you look at this over here, you can just almost see how his mind is working. He's just looking at the hand and going deeper and deeper. And looking over here, he's thinking out loud about just how does a finger do what it does. And when you look at this over here, these muscles, I could use this in an anatomy exam today. And the curriculum that I produced for my students before I take them abroad, I actually use Leonardo images with a drag and drop where they have to label the anatomy. And it's that accurate, decades, if not centuries ahead of what was going on in the medical schools. I keep saying that. These are about 1510. Let's look at what was going on in the medical schools in the same era. This is it right here. This is medical school anatomy books. I'm going to show you what I describe as the viscera, abdominopelvic anatomy, done by Leonardo in a little bit. I want you to look here at abdominopelvic cavities at around 1900. Okay? You see a female sitting here on a table, or on a chair, I guess I should say. And right here in the middle, can you see what they're trying to represent? Maybe I can do it with the pointer a little bit differently. But can you see right here and then right here? That's the liver and gallbladder. And then right here is one kidney and another kidney. And then these lines coming down are the two ureters that come down eventually to the urinary bladder. And then here's the uterus and the cervix and a flayed open vagina. See what they're looking at? What's anatomically inaccurate? Even if we just ignore the fact that it doesn't look perfect as far as the way the organs are shaped, what about their placement? If this is the liver, it's on the wrong side. So you had anatomists working with artists, and the way this piece is done, it's a woodblock engraving. So how would you do a woodblock engraving if you're producing a book? You would engrave the book, then you would put ink on that, and then the paper on top of that and pull it away. What am I driving at? It'll flip and be mirror imaged unless you carve it opposite of what it is. So when you look at many errors that were going on in the medical schools, it had to do because of a miscommunication between the artists and the anatomists and the bookmaking. And there was also maybe not even an interest that it really matters all that much. We're just taking an inventory of the organs and placing them there. That was Leonardo. They had to be accurate. They had to be perfect as he saw them. You look at this piece over here, this is about 1520. Berengario de Carpi, who was a famous anatomist at the University of Bologna. And there is some accuracy here where if you can see in his right hand, he's lifting up muscles where you see if he were to lay them down in front, the fibers would go down and in, and that's the external obliques. And he lifts them up to expose to you the internal obliques. And that's the way the fibers go, down and away. And in the center here is rectus abdominis, and those fibers are incorrectly referenced. They're supposed to go vertically. They do not go obliquely. But this is what you got in medical schools in the 1520s. And I'll show you earlier, before, and I'll show you more now, what Leonardo was doing all by himself in 1500. This is one of my favorite pieces. There are about 200 anatomical drawings by Leonardo, more than that. And I'm only going to show you just a sampling over here. But this piece over here is where Leonardo looks at not only structure, but function as well. He's looking at how do these muscles work? How do they pull on the bones? Because one of the most famous muscles of the body he's representing right here, which is Biceps Brachii. And it works, it inserts on the radius. And do you see how the radius and the ulna are parallel here? But here they're crossed up. And he's writing how that muscle, when it contracts, it helps with this action over here, which is called pronation. And no one had really done that in the medical schools. And you know, these writings have all been interpreted that you see over here. And this is a sophisticated group. Remember, I mostly speak to undergraduates, right? It's a whole different world talking to them. But how did Leonardo write? Mirror image. Do you know what I mean when I say that? We believe Leonardo was left-handed. There's tons of evidence to support that by virtue of his brushstrokes. Any of you who are left-handed, you have to hold your book a weird way because you may smear your ink. Well, Leonardo didn't want to smear his ink, so instead of writing from left to right with his right hand, he would just write from right to left and just flip it in his head. A lot of people early on were saying, well, it was a code, so no one could understand his work. Well, you read it just by holding it up to a mirror. Trust me, if Leonardo didn't want you to be able to read his code, you wouldn't be able to crack his code just by holding it up to a mirror, right? So this was just Leonardo doing his own thing for his own personal notes. And you look at this piece over here, it's a very small drawing and says so much about how forward-thinking he was. Because if you look right here, this is the maxillary sinus. So you have an open space right behind your cheekbone, kind of, right here. Whenever you get sick, you feel it, right? Because that sinus becomes all clogged up. And you look above the eye, what we call the orbit right here, this is the frontal sinus, another opening inside the bone. And both of those communicate with the nasal cavity. Like when you get well, you feel all that fluid drip out of your nose. Well, everybody knows that. Nobody knew that. The anatomists in the medical schools didn't understand the sinuses, the openings inside these bones, but Leonardo did because he thought in 3 dimensions. Can you see what he's trying to show you here? Where on the right side, as you're looking at it, is a superficial skull that he then sawed to show you it deeper down inside. So he's thinking in 3 dimensions in a way like no one else had, and he's coming up with discoveries, these open spaces inside the bones called the sinuses that the physicians didn't understand for perhaps another century. I want to use this piece to make the point that as wonderful and as forward-thinking as Leonardo was, he was wrong a lot, especially because of the fact that he was seduced by Galen and Aristotle and Hippocrates, which is what all the Renaissance masters read, which were the writings of the ancients, the Greeks, who understood biology and tried to describe how things were. So these masters read and then sometimes drew the anatomy to represent the way they thought it should look because there was a bit of a dogma about the writings of Galen and Hippocrates and Aristotle. So things like Aristotle, Galen, they said the heart only has 2 chambers. You don't have to be a physician or an anatomist to understand. How many chambers does the heart have? 4. 2 upper atria and 2 much larger ventricles. Well, the ancients wrote there's only 2 chambers, so Leonardo only drew it with 2 chambers. Can you see that? All right, so he corrected this later. You can also see there's many other anatomical inaccuracies. This liver and spleen doesn't look quite right. But a spleen does get large when people are ill at the end of their lives, so perhaps that could be it. And then these over-represented horns coming off of the uterus right here. And many times we think this is because he dissected many animals. And if you dissect an ox, they have these bicornuate uteri where they have these big projections. And many times the inaccuracies were because they dissected an animal and then just portrayed it on top of a human. And when we look at this particularly compelling image, for me, it represents physiology, largely embryology. And this is classic Galenic embryology. Right? First, you've got this really interesting image to look at. We describe this as mid-sagittally section, cut down the center, right, of a body, a couple united during sexual intercourse. So let's look at it from a couple of perspectives. Right? The first perspective is, which of the two, the male or the female, gets drawn in entirety? He does. The only thing we draw for her is her uterus and breasts, which is really all she brings to the conversation when it comes to reproduction. Because what was believed? Many different ideas. But one of them was pretty much the male provided everything, and the uterus was merely the incubator for the offspring. Right? So you see the male providing everything, not only the physical, but also the spirit. So Galen and others wrote about these fictitious vessels, and Leonardo draws them, that connect from the brain all the way down the spinal cord and then come off and go into the penis to deliver this humanity and spirit, if you will. And I joke with my students, maybe there is some truth that a man's brain is connected to his, but we'll move on from there. You could also see the heart right here and some vessels that come off and go directly into the penis as well to give another type of spirit, right? So those didn't exist. Leonardo didn't see them, but he drew them. Another vessel that comes off of the uterus right here and comes up and goes to the breast was believed, and this is a fictitious vessel that he drew, was, how do we explain that a woman's breasts swell during pregnancy and then she gives forth the fluid after having the baby? Well, it must be because the menses that is retained during gestation is diverted to the breasts and then used for the milk to feed the child. So they drew that. Does that make sense? So let's look at Leonardo for his genius, but let's also look at Leonardo where he's anatomically inaccurate. But let's understand why. It was because he was drawing things the way the ancients said that they were. I ask you now to hearken back to that anatomical viscera that we were laughing about before, where the liver was on the wrong side of the body. That was done in around 1500, and so was this next piece right here. So this is a viscera done by Leonardo. Can you see how the stomach and the intestines are all drawn pretty accurately? And he even takes some time to talk about, what do you think he's trying to draw over here? The appendix, the vermiform appendix, the bigger sac on the bottom left that looks like it's labeled number M. That's the cecum, right? And then that little, looks like it's numbered the letter N over there is what we call the vermiform appendix, the worm-shaped appendix, or simply the appendix. Leonardo found it. I do dissection with my students. I have some pretty smart students. They can't find it. They have to dig around forever, Oh, this patient, this donor must have had an appendectomy. That's why I can't find it. And I have to come over and we find it. And Leonardo found it, And think of what Leonardo was working with in 1500, 1510, late at night with a candle, with blood all over his hands and some scissors and scalpels and so forth. I want to look at his skeletal renderings. I find them perhaps the most impressive. Look at just how beautiful he shows the curvature of the spine, which wasn't really fully understood in anatomical textbooks. And I want to blow up over here, all right, what we call the atlantoaxial joint. The first cervical vertebrae, which you call C1, is also called Atlas, which I think is a great name because it's the god Atlas that holds up the world. The first cervical vertebrae holds up your head. The second cervical vertebra, which you see right here, is called the axis. Can you see that projection upwards in the middle? That's an axis that the C1 rotates about. And that's how you say yes and no, or should you say no when you turn your head. See how Leonardo's showing structurally how all those come together and how they work? It's really quite remarkable in how forward-thinking he was. So let's look at that vertebra, that spinal column that you see there, and let's look at what Berengario de Carpi did, who was at the vanguard of anatomy at the University of Bologna in 1521. He wrote one of the anatomical Bibles, if you will, that was used in all the European medical schools. This is his skeletal system, one of his skeletal system images. I think it's an interesting image. You can see the influence of the Renaissance, how they have beautiful backgrounds over here. I mean, really, I'm a co-author on an anatomy and physiology textbook, and we don't have beautiful backgrounds on our images, right? We just got the bodies sitting there on a white image. So you see this very, I would argue, Italian influence and Renaissance influence just to have it beautiful. And anatomically, I've got some major problems with it. First of all, what we see right here is a very blocky pelvis, which is just not really much attention to detail for its anatomical accuracy. And let's look at the ribs over here. Do you see how there's these little knives, sticking out, off to the side? Now, there's an explanation for this. I want to explain these inaccuracies. If you don't know, let me just gauge the sophistication as it relates to anatomy of this group. How many ribs do you have? No one wants to say. Everyone's afraid, right? How many do you have? 12 pair. If you want full credit on the exam, you have 12 pair, right? One on each side. So 10 of them by cartilages or directly attached to the sternum. The last 2 attach to nothing, right? They just stick out, and they're called floating ribs. But the lower ribs above that, from like rib 8 down, 7, 8, 9, 10 down, those attach to the sternum by cartilages, not by ossified hard bone. So what do you think happened over here? The specimen that was used to make this was probably a skeleton that was taken from the gallows of a body hanging on the outside of the city, was thoroughly picked clean and decomposed, and the costal cartilages were probably gone. When I say the costal cartilages, I mean the cartilaginous, non-hard, bony component, leaving the bone that comes off the vertebrae just like that. I hope I explained that well. So the point is how fresh a cadaver you get, how much attention you give to detail. Let's look at what Leonardo did 2 decades earlier. This is Leonardo's most complete skeletal rendering that survives to us today, where you can see, and he does it very shaded, I really want to take some time, can you see, if you look down here, how he shows clearly all the curves of the spine? And he's showing it over here. Even the femur, the bow, if you will, the arch of the femur is absolutely beautiful. And can you see how he represents all the ribs accurately and completely? And can you see on the bottom, he shows two little floating ribs, we call them, sticking out. So Leonardo's anatomy was really quite spectacular and ahead of everybody. And I really want to talk about this curve, if you will, of the spine. This is Andreas Vesalius. If you're familiar with who he is, we really consider him to be the father of modern anatomy. He worked at the University of Padua outside of Venice, published a beautiful tome called the Fabrica in about 1542. So this is 1542, totally the best anatomy that existed throughout Europe, and it's a beautiful piece. I love it. But look at how bolt straight upright the vertebrae are. And the tilt of the pelvis is incorrect as well. Because why? Well, the thinking is they wired together a skeleton for the artist to do the engraving. And by the way, the artists were thought to be out of the school of Titian in Venice. But they wired it together just on a hard rod and didn't take effort to sort of have it have the curves. Leonardo's eye was just entirely too keen to omit that. So here you see at roughly 1510, Leonardo. And here you see in the medical schools in the 1540s. Who has a better vertebral column? Clearly, Leonardo. So a lot of these images, you look at them and they're just beautiful works of art, right? Some of them aren't all that impressive when you first look at them. This particular one, I don't know if you can see what Leonardo's trying to get at, it's cross-sectional anatomy. It is like modern MRI and CT. He thought in 3 dimensions in a way that the anatomists of the day were not. So he even writes, I don't like doing this because it's such a mess, in so many words. Because now when we do this, and I have textbooks full of images that are horizontally sectioned, we have hardening reagents and freeze them down to, almost absolute zero, and saws that are diamond-studded circular saws to get perfect cuts. Could you imagine being in a hospital near Santa Maria Novella in Florence, late at night, with a recently deceased corpse and a saw, just doing this? And then making as many sketches as possible at the time. This image over here leads me into one of his greatest, most forward-thinking techniques that he used to understand anatomy, to understand open spaces inside organs. If you look over here, what Leonardo is talking about are the ventricles of the brain. The ventricles are open spaces inside the brain, and it's there that cerebrospinal fluid is produced, and then it circulates from there. He knew that there were spaces in there. And the way that he achieved understanding what these spaces were like was by use of what we call casting technique. What he did was he injected molten wax into those spaces and then broke away the organ to actually see the shape. Using his understanding of casting technique as an artist, because he was probably trained to cast as if, you know what I mean when I say lost wax technique in making bronze. So you would have the wax and then the plaster over top of that, and then you'd pour the molten bronze in there, and how you'd have to leave a hole or opening for air and for everything to come out. And he writes about how you need to stick a pipe up into the bottom of the brain and inject it here so that the air could go out, using his training as an artist to understand this anatomy. And that's just on this one sheet. He's also thinking about the cranial nerves that come off the brain, and then over here, a male reproductive anatomy. I don't know if you know what we're looking at. It's a posterior aspect of male reproductive organs, meaning you're looking from behind, which is an unusual view because he was trying to demonstrate some of the glands. That's the urinary bladder. Coming above are the 2 ureters that come off the kidney, and then you see the 2 testes and penis in the center. But just above the testes are the 2 seminal vesicles. I do this dissection. I've removed full male urogenital tracts. It's not a convenient thing to do. It takes a long time, and it's easy to make mistakes on it. And when I look at, I have a real keen appreciation for what Leonardo did, was because I'm doing some of these same things now, and I can't imagine him doing it in his day, and then illustrating it so richly. So let's build on this idea of the ventricles. What I showed you just a moment ago was Leonardo's second shot at trying to understand the ventricles. His first conversation about that is this right here, and this is how he drew them. He drew them as 3 concentric or in series cavities. You can see it drawn down over here from the side and here looking down from the top. He also sections a skull and represents the frontal sinus that we talked about before, the first to do that. But if I blow up down over here and take it and blow it up over here, this is what Galen and Hippocrates said the ventricles were. 3 in-series openings that then connected to the optic nerves, connecting to the eye. Leonardo drew it that way. Then he started to dissect. And then he said, that's not the way it looks. And that's when he began to do his casting technique to really get the shape. And these are some of the images from that. The first one that I just showed you a moment ago, so all of these right here are about in the era of 1490 to 1492. That was his first great era of dissecting of that total of 30 cadavers. And here you see it around 1508, 1509. So he began to correct. That's the point. He was interested in doing it correctly, understanding what it really looked like. I have this lecture with my students about what is science. Science is the truth. Science is understanding nature and what does it really look like. And we see Leonardo pursuing that in a scientific method. So you see these renderings over here, really an interesting angle. This is more accurate. This is more accurate. I'm going to put them all on a page now for you, where you could see a handful of his ventricles of the brain. Now I'm going to show you the ventricles of the brain from the anatomy textbook that I am a co-author on, and this is what they accurately look like. So how close was Leonardo? Pretty close. And when we try to say, where did he get it wrong? Well, this big bulge right over here, this is the 3rd ventricle, and this is the 4th ventricle, and they're not quite that big. But we think it's because the wax was so thick and viscous as he pushed it in there, he sort of expanded the space more than in reality that it is. But he was still getting closer by 100 years, 200 years more than the anatomists, all by use of casting technique. He also used casting technique for one of his most impressive discoveries, which is how the aortic valve works. And I want you to look at this right here. So this is the aortic valve. So this is the aorta coming above it. This is the left ventricle. Here it is closed. On this side, here it is open. So when your left ventricle contracts, the pressures rise. Blood comes up this way. The pressures are greater than what's in the aorta, pushes the blood up and out. But the aorta, the left ventricle just contracts for an instant, and the pressures go up for an instant, and it ejects it out. And then that blood immediately falls back and winds up closing. Where am I at? Right, winds up closing the aortic valve by virtue of the blood falling back. And can you see by those arrows, over here we're showing the blood pushing the valve open, and over here we're seeing as the blood falls back, it fills up the 3 concave cusps that makes up the aortic valve. If you were to go into any medical school, and certainly the way I teach it, it just goes up and it falls back. That's how it works. Leonardo was looking at it and said, I don't think so. These are his drawings, and I'm going to blow up on the bottom right, which you're looking at, over to here. Leonardo said, that's not the deal. If it just fell back, it would sort of crumple the valve and it would never close. I think it has to do with what we now call the sinuses of Valsalva, which is when you come up out of the left ventricle, when you go into the aorta, it has an opening. So you go from a large left ventricle through a narrowing out the valve to an opening that's wide in the sinuses of Valsalva in the aorta to getting smaller. You get turbulence in there. You get eddies or vortices, whatever you want to say. And it's those vortices that wind up closing the valve. And that's what he's trying to show you here. Right? So this is the left ventricle. This is the valve over here coming up. And now we're in the aorta. But can you see where it's wider right here? It's these vortices that close it. So this is what Leonardo wrote in 1510, let's say, something like that. We don't teach it that way. Well, it wasn't until some journal articles were published, Robesek put it together, and I want you just to look at what he wrote in the abstract. Recent studies indicate that eddy currents generated by the sinuses of Valsalva play an important role in the physiological closure of the aortic valve. This process is briefly discussed in the paper, and evidence is presented that this fact was well known and elaborated upon by the Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci. So this was in the Annals of Thoracic Surgery in 1991, where Robesek puts together the works done by Bellhouse and others who were engineers. And these engineers in the 50s and 60s were saying, we figured out how the aortic valve works. And then other researchers in the 90s are saying, Leonardo knew that in 1510. Right? And that really wasn't brought to us until the last generation or so. So Leonardo knew hundreds of years ahead. And as I've told you many times, I am presenting the work of many others today and just trying to piece it all together and tell his story. And some of you were talking before we came in, the famous physician, surgeon, and Leonardo scholar, Francis Wells, has some software, and he gives a very similar talk that I'm giving right now, so I give him all the credit. I liberated this off a website, where he animates how it works. So they took Leonardo's work and then just animated it to show, and what I'm trying to have you look at is right here, it's these vortices, because what Leonardo did was he took, I'll go back a slide here. What he did was, with the casting technique, he injected wax, filled up all these spaces in here, put gypsum and whatnot on top of that, used that to make a glass model of the heart, and then pumped into it water with grass seeds so he could see the eddies, to understand how it works. And this isn't because he's publishing it. If he had published his work, which he was intending to do, but if he had published his work, he would have transformed the study of anatomy. Right? And this is just him doing his own, as I keep saying, ruminations. Right? We go to the next slide. But let's look at his art that we're all familiar with. Here we see the Annunciation that's in the Uffizi, that his understanding of anatomy influences art, and it certainly did. When you look at the angel Gabriel about to announce the coming of the Christ, you look here, first I want to make this point. This part of the wing, this part of the wing right here was added by another artist. I don't know if you knew that. This part of the wing that you're looking at, see if I can highlight it. All of this is what Leonardo did, and can you see how it looks exactly like a bird's wing? So, and it's the most accurate bird's wing ever shown in an angel, because that's how Leonardo is. So now, I get this question all the time from my Italian friends. How did Leonardo's work all wind up at the Royal Collection? I don't know if you know this. Everything I've shown you is by courtesy of the Royal Collection. I contacted them. They said, yes, you're allowed to use all these pieces. They've been very good about scanning all these images, putting them on the website, and allowing people to use them for scholarship. But what happened is, and how it fell into the Royal Collection Trust, if you don't recognize it, this is Windsor Castle. That's where they're all at. That's where they're all archived. When this talk started, there was a profile of Francesco Melzi, who was a student of Leonardo. When Leonardo died, he willed everything to Melzi. Melzi died in 1570, gave it to sculptor Pompeo Leoni, and Leoni had them bound into a book, probably multiple books. We think many of them were lost, but one of them wound up working its way to England. And I love it when you go to the Royal Collection website. I'm going to quote them right now. By 1630, one of those albums found its way to Europe. So exactly how it got there, I think, is a story for other research, right? Because I think my Italian friends are a little peeved about that. But by 1670, King Charles II found them, and it wasn't until 1900 that they were unbound and made available to the world. Really, these Leonardo drawings we're talking about are only really out there in the general public for a little over 100 years. So this is the actual binding. And you could see this, but all of the papers have been taken out and published and framed and so forth. And through a colleague of mine who's an anatomist who has published with the Royal Collection, I was granted access to see them at Windsor Castle. And this was in September 2017. I got all these permissions. I had to go through security, and they gave me, I had to wear a coat and tie, as you can see over here, very British. My wife wasn't allowed to come with me on the inside, only scholars. And on the directions, it said, go here into the castle, whatever. And then it said, go in the side door entrance. And I didn't know that the sign would be side door entrance, that was on the top over there. And you go up and you go inside, and it's very cool. And they would only let me take one photo. And this is it. And they wouldn't let me be in the photo. I wanted to be. They're like, no, this is for scholarship, not for tourism. And I understand that. So the one that I took, I put the gloves and the magnifying glass to give you some perspective. But the room itself, and really it was Martin Clayton, who's the curator, who granted me access through a colleague of mine who's collaborated with Martin Clayton. And if you didn't notice, National Geographic did a beautiful article about Leonardo in the last month or so. So I went to their website, and I stole this off their website. But this is Martin Clayton right here in the room where they're all housed. So that picture I took, I'm standing right there. And you see these cabinets behind? They're these beautiful big boxes that are, all cataloged, and that's where Leonardo's drawings are. Out of view and available online. But because this is Leonardo500, the Royal Collection has actually taken all of these, that are great, 200 of them, and made them available with a beautiful exhibit that's the once-in-a-generation exhibit, and from what I'm told from my friends, it'll never be on exhibit again during any of our lifetimes. So if you're available by the end of March, you need to go and see it. This is from it's called A Life in Drawing, and I just took this off their website to just show you how they're celebrating it. Beautiful little melody showing Leonardo, a life in drawing as an artist and as a scientist and as a genius. I want you to see how Leonardo writes backwards. They really played with this nicely. Beautiful, right? So, these are available in London until October 13th. So make sure you run over there to see the 200 drawings. After that, from November 22nd to March 15th, they'll be on display in Scotland. After that, they'll be off display. So if you can get over to Europe, go for it. So as I begin to close, I just want to give some appreciation when I got to go and see the exhibit. This is one of my favorites. It wasn't until I saw it in person that I realized just how small it is. And these aren't the best pictures, but they give you perspective. And another one that's one of my favorites, I want you to show you how much larger it is. And that first one was from his first generation. This is from his second generation, where clearly, and all of these are, he was intending them to be studies for what he was going to do in a textbook. So when most of the world thinks of Leonardo, what do they think of? Mona Lisa in France. And when we also think of Leonardo, we think of Virgin of the Rocks or the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, also in France. But of course, one of the most famous, thankfully we're back to Italian museums, right, and churches. We have the Last Supper. And if you haven't been to Florence in a while, go to the Uffizi, relatively recently put on display after restoration, is the Adoration of the Magi. It's unfinished. In the same room right next to Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ. But as you know, the angel on the far left and parts of Jesus and even the feet were all thought to be done by Leonardo. And you could see his understandings of eddies and water and how it moves shown there. So we see Leonardo as an artist, but we also see him as a scientist. In the statue in Milan, it says on the bottom over there, the renovator of the arts and sciences. And outside of the Uffizi, we put Leonardo up on a pedestal for a good reason. And if I could ever go back in time, you often think about that. Who would you like to meet? I'd love to meet Leonardo. And when I was there last summer, I kind of sort of did. But think of Leonardo not just as a painter, but also think of him as a great anatomist who made contributions that were just completely unparalleled. And think of the era that he did it in and how difficult it was to do it. And here I see Leonardo in his studio trying to find the perfect model for the Vitruvian Man, and just how many times he must have been frustrated. But let's not forget that this whole story is told along the Italian peninsula, and there is so much genius on the Italian peninsula and so much for us to celebrate in science and arts and culture there. And I want to close by saying, as many of you may say yourselves, there's two kinds of people in this world, Italians and those who wish they were, right? So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. So I have the reference list here, which is hard for you to remember. I have a website that you can go to, and I sort of highlighted it over there where it says resources. I can give you a card if you want. I have all the original journal articles for everything that really inform the underpinnings of this talk for you to go and see. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to entertain any questions. Thank you. I'm happy to entertain questions. Yes. I can hardly see. Keep that in mind.
Were female bodies dissected?
Very rarely. So the default anatomy was the male anatomy. The only time you would ever show, and this isn't just Leonardo, right? This is in all of scholarship. So the default anatomy was male anatomy. The only time you would dissect a female was to show reproduction. And I showed you an image over there, which was a whole other talk, where it had the fetus that was inside there. Do you remember what that fetus looked like? See it over there? What position is it in? Is this a very good presentation? Buttocks down. That's a vertex breach, right? I ask my students, so why do you think Leonardo drew it like this? Oh, he was trying to help with delivery? No, this woman pushed for God knows how many hours and died. And that's how Leonardo got access to her body, right? So a lot of it was just geared around midwifery, understanding female anatomy as it relates to reproduction. That was pretty much it. Good question. Anything else? Yes, sir, in the front.
Was there evidence that he dissected animals?
A lot of ox, cow, right? Horse, you bet. Pig.
What's the story of the sacrosyndrome?
Questions, please.
Really?
What are the questions?
Yeah, I can't hear this one. So he asked if he did animals, and that's why I said yes, cows and so forth. But yes, ask your question, maybe with the microphone. It's this woman right here. Yeah.
Yes. I read in an article there is this hypothesis that Leonardo was actually the one that created the sacrasindone. There was the fabric that was supposedly covering Christ's body, and that's saved in Torino, in the Royal Palace, I guess, in Torino. Have you heard
I know what she means, the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah.
Is that what you're referencing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm completely unfamiliar with that line of inquiry, and Leonardo's role in that. I apologize. Mi dispiace.
Okay.
Right. There's a woman right over here, or maybe I'll let him handle it. He takes it.
Okay, outside of anatomy, I was wondering if you got a chance to see the codex over at the Reagan Library of Leonardo's.
I did not. I have not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it was a lot of notes and things like people are talking about animals, and he had flying machines based on birds and studies and things like that, and it was very in detail. It was great. So they did live models, and I guess it was from Milan, and it only made it here in America for that. But
I do know last year when I was in Florence, there was a special exhibit off to the side that had the one that Bill Gates had purchased. That was on display there, and another one, and I can't remember which one. But a lot of it is just manuscript writings, not as richly illustrated as the collection that's in the Royal Collection in Windsor Castle. That's as rich as it gets.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the extent to which the authority of Galen really obfuscated the reality of anatomy, and how even somebody like Leonardo was under this spell. It's kind of surprising.
Yes. So I can speak to that. That's a line of inquiry I am familiar with, right? So the writings of the ancients were considered indeed dogma, and it was heretical to undo. Why would we do more dissection or investigate the body? Galen told us everything we need to know. Hippocrates told us everything we need to know. Why would you do more, right? So, dove la verità? In il corpo o in il libri, right? Where is the truth? In the body or in the books, right? And the truth is in the body. And that's what we see Leonardo doing over here silently and on his own. But when you look at it, if you're familiar with Andreas Vesalius at Padua, he was the beginning of really undoing the Galenic, pillars. And it cost him his career in many ways, because there were many Galenists who criticized him, and he had to leave academia and burn his notes because of that. So it took many, many years for that to crumble. And, there's a whole other line of inquiry you can talk about. That wasn't just in the life sciences, it was in the physical sciences, because roughly in the same era, Galileo was trying to undo everything with his observations, saying, not so much Galen, but, others, and the church, of course, saying that the earth was the center, and he's doing these observations and saying, I'm telling you, I have no agenda but the truth. But we're not in the middle. The sun is, we're going around it. And it took a long time. But where did that change occur? As much of a struggle as it was, I would argue it was in the Italian peninsula. All right? Then that's the birth of modern science. Other questions? You're better than my students.
I'm going to go with her first.
So my understanding is that it was illegal to be doing these dissections. And I'm wondering if, one, what would have happened had Leonardo been discovered, particularly as a young man?
Right.
And are there any stories of him being discovered, and how did he deal with that?
Here's what I can speak to. I know that his work with the brain was truncated by the church authorities where he was doing it. So he only had human brains for a while, and then he completed his work with ox brains. I do know that. So Leonardo wasn't going to be thrown in jail for this, right? But it was prohibited. And I even want to take a step back further and look at it at 30,000 feet. It's just not completely accurate to say that the Catholic Church completely prohibited dissection, right, and the opening of the body. That's just too broad a statement and not full. They controlled it, And we know, for those of you that are old school Catholic, I was raised old school Roman Catholic, right? And all the churches are their relics and pieces of human bodies that are, So it was okay to open the body for human relics. It was okay to open the body for suspicious deaths. And it was also okay to open the body in the university under our guidelines, right? Only so many done a year with the church watching, so forth. And it was part of your punishment for those of you raised old school Roman Catholic. Back in the day, were you allowed to be cremated according to the Catholic Church? No. You had to be kept whole for the resurrection, right? That the Pope has changed on that. Right? But back in those days, part of your punishment was to be dissected at the university. Because we're going to kill you now to sort of ruin you in this life, but we're going to dismember you to ruin you in the next life as well, right? Then there was even orders of priests in Rome whose job it was to comfort the condemned. Right? And then to collect the remains, to give them a Christian burial after that. And to say 30 masses for that person to hasten their exit out of purgatory. Purgatory's gone too now. You know that, right? So there was definitely the church overseeing all of these things, but it didn't completely prohibit it. And I can't think of anyone being burned at the stake for doing that I'm familiar with. But it was done surreptitiously in the middle of the night, and it was considered a sacrilege. Because what's the greatest of God's creations? The body, right? And it's the vessel for the soul and the vehicle for the resurrection. So to cut it up is really messing with God in a way.
Thank you for your talk. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
I'm curious about scientific communication at this time. If Leonardo's drawings were shared with other anatomists, if there's any communication between Padua and maybe Montpellier, can you tell us a little bit about that?
What I can speak to briefly in this environment right here was that Leonardo's work was only known to Leonardo and his people closest to him. It really, I could say this in general terms, it wasn't disseminated to the world until about 1900. There were people before that had them and collected his papers, but it was a very small group of people and scholars and collectors, and that was it. It wasn't until you get more into the modern era that more people knew, and that's why I made a comment earlier. If he had published it on an academic level, I think he would have moved the science ahead by a century, or more. So Leonardo was quick. Not that I know of. Leonardo was doing his own thing, running around trying to get jobs and patrons all the time and doing these off to the side for his own intellectual curiosity and maybe for a publication that we never realized. Between medical schools, there was publication. I mean, if you get into the 1540s, when you look at the big one, which was the Vesalius' Fabrica, that blew up all over Europe. And prior to that was, you don't want to get too far off in the weeds, but the University of Bologna, Mondino de Luizzi and then Berengario de Carpi, they were publishing books that were used all over the medical schools. So that's going back to, de Luizzi was a manuscript that was before the printing press. So that was in 1316. But then in the late 1400s, that was put into a printed form, and then it really got dispersed throughout Europe. So the first medical books for anatomy were really the Italians. Now, people from other parts of the world, if you're familiar with Raziz, who was Persian, Vicina from India, they had writings too that were used in European universities. But the Italian anatomy books were really quite different from everything else. The other ones were more medicine, botany, pharmacology.
Thank you. I'm curious about an issue. I wonder if you have any information about it. There's a difference between religious doctrine and legal rules of statutory law. And I'm wondering whether there were both applicable to somebody doing a dissection of a body.
Yes, so let me speak to what comes to my mind, while we're talking about it. I know at the University of Bologna and Padua, the universities published what were called statutes or canons that governed human dissection. And if you don't know, the University of Bologna, we consider that the first university in the modern sense, 1088. But it was a papal state university under the rule of Rome and felt a bit restrictive. So Padua was part of the Venetian Republic, a whole other country, and they wanted the prestige of a university, so they offered academic freedom to the Bolognese students and professors, and they left. And that's 1222, which is the sixth, oldest university, probably second oldest in Italy. But at any rate, they published statutes to control it. For example, for you to be dissected at the university, be executed prisoner and so forth, it couldn't be a local. You had to be from at least 30 miles out of the city center. That was one of the statutes for that. Why do you think that would be? Family. Do you think the locals would be really happy with the university if one of your family members committed a capital crime and not only were you hung, that's bad enough, right? But now we're going to take you to the university. So we'll just have it be done by foreigners. That's what they call it, foreigners, more than 30 miles from the city center. So there were many statutes that regulated this to help keep it to be in order. And that would be independent of religious, right? That would be more civic or civil kind of statute because they wanted to maintain order in the city.
Here in the United States, we're used to, as you know, statutes by legislature.
Yes.
And then the church has whatever religious doctrines. So is it the case that in a papal state there was no lay legislature passing laws on this subject?
No, I can't say that because Bologna was part of the papal states, and they did pass statutes governing the dissection of the bodies at the university. If I'm answering your question, I don't know if
I think you said a university like
right.
Bologna passed a statute, but I wonder if that is a statute such as a legislative statute.
No, I think that was from the university, not from the municipality, if that's what you mean.
So in violation of a university rule, then someone could...
The university was a pretty big, heavy player in the city. So we're getting into an area that I'm not as confident to speak on any more than what I've said already, which was that the university definitely indeed controlled it. Bologna was a papal state and did have some say over it. Sure. Anything else? You've been a lovely audience. Thank you so much for your attention.